Historically, numbers were the first mathematics. The number 5 turns out to the point where most humans lose count. To explain that shows something of the problems early humans had when learning numbers. Generally, when you put down 5 or more objects, you can't tell how many without counting. For objects less than 5, you can tell how many without counting. Knowing how many people are in a theater drives this home. And this is how early people understood numbers. They had concrete words for 1, 2, and many. Then they graduated to 3, 4, 5, 8, 9, 10, 12, 60. Their problem was not being able to transform from one number to another. They couldn't notice the equivalence of 3 plus 4 and 6 plus 1. The Nebra disk is the latest and greatest example of this theater understanding of numbers. The Nebra disk has a boat, the sun, moon, the Pleiades, and 2 gold leafs on the sides. They seem to be equivalent to the angles between the solstices. The Nebra sky disk dates to like 1600 BC. There was a recent redating. This is a bronze disk, not an iron disk. So, I don't know how they can date this to the Iron Age. The dating doesn't really change conclusions on my mathematical points about the 2 gold leafs on the sides marking the solstices. They did not calculate the angle like counting the number of the angles or solving an algebraic equation. They just transferred the angle from a Stonehenge-like circle to the disk. Kind of like in geometry, where you use your compass and transfer a length from one line or angle to another. The people who put those 2 gold leafs on had a theater understanding of numbers. The mathematics of Stonehenge shows that even the simplest mathematics is an insight overcoming out flat earth preconceptions. Archaeologists have found lots of Stonehenges. This one is in contemporary Israel. It's called Rujim el-Hiri and dates to 3000 BC. The Old Testament mentions Gilgals, which means circle of 12 stones. Circular stones certainly seem like some form of Stonehenge. All the stone circles are always rough and jagged surfaces. They just took some stone and flopped it there. They sometimes put such a stone on top of 2 such jagged surfaces. But Stonehenge appears to have straight, surface-smoothed lintel ceilings. Note, the post columns of Stonehenge are still potato-shaped, but the tops of the posts are shaped enough to form-fit with the stones covering the column stones. One way to make a smooth surface is to take a string and attach a ball at the end and then move the perpendicular line string across the surface. Anytime the ball hits a bump, then carve that bump out. This is the beginning of a famous mathematical theorem about isosceles triangles. The isosceles theorem is that of the 2 base angles being equal. How to prove it? First, you have to construct an isosceles triangle, and that takes some proving as well. But let's assume the isosceles triangle is constructed. First, you need to draw a straight line from the top, perpendicular to the base of the 2 equal angles below. First, we know the sides split between the perpendicular line, and the 2 angles make equal line segments. And then we know the 2 hypotenuse sides are equal, and so we know 2 triangles generated by splitting the original triangle by the perpendicular line are congruent. Therefore, the 2 angles of those 2 congruent triangles must be equal. The isosceles theorem actually takes us into geometric mathematics. The earliest technology outside of stone tools is architecture. Architecture evolved out of caves. I'd argue that the architecture of homes is like mankind building their own caves. There's some evidence of the evolution from caves to making artificial caves. Here's El Wad Terrace in contemporary Israel. It's an extension of the cave they lived in. This gave them the technological practice to make architecture. Ed Wad Terrace goes back over 10,000 years ago. The last of the cave dwellers is about 8,000 years ago. Below is a Greek Corinthian cave. The mathematics of geometry is almost certainly the abstraction of this early architecture age. The architecture of the Mesopotamians and Egyptians was much more mathematics. It was because of mathematics that they made their flat surface and Platonic solids architecture. One of the greatest architectural innovations is the arch. The arch, for me, symbolizes intelligence and mathematics. The arch as the symbol of mathematical knowledge. Whatever the case may be, on whether the makers of Stonehenge had some kind of mathematical knowledge to make smooth surfaces, most Stonehenges did not. And these stone circles were not much above the bees and ants making their hives. I'm showing that mankind's natural language and mathematical science took reasoning beyond animal logic, language, and flat earth perspective. And the arch is the first technological development that proves mankind is beyond the animals. So I want to explain the arch. The above picture is of a Roman aqueduct in France. Below is the biggest post-lintel architecture in human history, the Great Hypostyle Hall. Making big things with ever larger sidewalls and a stone block on top gets heavier and heavier. So hauling heavier stones gets harder and harder, but also the lintel ceiling has a higher chance of splitting and falling down. The stress points in the middle of the ceiling become so great that it breaks. To prevent that, with post column and lintel and ceiling, one crowds the columns. Just observe the famous hundreds of rows of columns at Egypt's Karnak. How can one support a ceiling above without carrying all that weight? Both the post columns and top lintel ceiling? One breaks up the columns into more manageable pieces. Then as you stack them up, make the top ceiling part of the columns and meet at a point, the keystone. The Roman aqueduct above is a great example. I explain the arch because it symbolizes mathematics and intelligence. It takes looking beyond initial impressions to invent. The result is a system of ideas that fit together like the beak of a hummingbird fits into the flower just right. All mathematical concepts are like this. The Stonehenges almost certainly had some relation to early mankind's astronomical knowledge, but they almost certainly used that knowledge more for spiritual reasons. Mathematics, mythology, existed at the same time. For proof, we have tally sticks that go back tens of thousands of years ago, and maybe even hundreds of thousands of years ago. This seashell with abstract notches dates to 500,000 years ago. Neanderthals made this abstract marking at the Rock of Gibraltar. Around 40,000 years ago, Jacob said at the end of the first episode of his Ascent of Man, about the cave paintings, "Man said I have power, but what power?" He's saying the people that made the cave paintings were trying to exercise a kind of magic. This idea of magic reminds me of how hunter-gatherers would wear the skull of the animal they killed, and even the hide. They felt powerful in doing so. I include a picture of a hand because it shows awareness of oneself. Here's a picture of the famous cave paintings. Sir James Fraser's The Golden Bough explains a world of magic before the god-S religions. What I find in Sir James Fraser's Golden Bough is that much of magic is evasive logic. The Göbeklitepe revolution. I always considered the cave paintings as before humanity was conscious of astronomical things. But recently, the dots on the cave paintings' animals have been shown to correspond to the seasonal patterns of animals' movements and when they give birth. More proof of humanity being conscious of astronomical things back in caveman days is Göbeklitepe. Another site, Tel Carmel, has the earliest astronomical motifs artwork. Archaeologists also found copper nuggets, which predates the Copper Age by thousands of years. They also found round stone towers, which appear similar to the Tower of Jericho, Göbeklitepe, and a dozen similar sites like Karahan Tepe, called into question when agricultural civilization began. It took them a while to prove it, but they found a site before Göbeklitepe that proves Göbeklitepe and associated sites were the beginning of agricultural civilization, Çakmaktepe. The transition from hunter-gatherer to agricultural civilization is one of archaeology's and science's biggest mysteries. The leap from hunter-gatherer to agricultural civilization is as big a leap as figuring out the Earth is round from our flat Earth perspective. This leap highlights my points about how knowledge works that I introduce above. Kind of like being able to see the simple pattern in a waterfall that otherwise looks like chaos. The hunter-gatherers had to go from wandering around with the animals to trusting the science and technology of agricultural civilization. This following of the movements of animals was seasonal or astronomical. As of writing this, archaeologists have shown the dots markings on the cave paintings were number of months that animals moved from location to location and gave birth. Plants follow the movement of the sun across the sky, like the sunflower, the blossom at the right temperature. Animals hibernate. There's even recent evidence that Neanderthals hibernated. They move to certain mating grounds based on the seasons and give birth seasonally. And the hunter-gatherer Homo sapiens followed them. Homo sapiens had to wait for the last glacial event to retreat around 21,000 years ago. Then we find in the Levant the ruins of Ohallo II. Ohallo II dates to 20,000 years ago and has much wild rice collected. Ohallo is considered a hunter-gatherer site. People would wander from temporary site to temporary site, and in Ohallo II, they'd collect seeds and plant them. From the Kabaran culture, which Ohallo II is part of, to Natufian, the animal bones and the plant remains went from wild plants and animal bones to domesticated. The flint stone technology in use for millions of years changed to small curved sickles. The sickle blades would later evolve into the plow to farm in harder to farm areas. Kind of the symbol of the agricultural age is pottery. Archaeologists can tell the difference between cultures because of the pottery art. The earliest known pottery goes back over 10,000 years ago in Asia. But Mesopotamians invented the potter's wheel about 6000 BC. The potter's wheel led to both the lathe and the mathematics of the circle. The major mathematics, pre-Greeks, was the triangle, which led to the Pythagorean theorem and the circumference of the circle. Before the Babylonian, Egyptian mathematics of the circle and triangle was maybe a variety of different base number systems. After that, they didn't have much mathematics to play with. They appear to have wanted to find mathematical puzzles. The calculus and abstract algebra was far beyond them, so they came up with mazes. Here's a Sumerian labyrinth. The Minoans have been most famous for labyrinths. Archaeologists have found lots of these on the island of Crete, which is where the Minoan civilization was found. Minoans are famous for their labyrinth temple of Knossos. This is one picture of bulls with a double axe in between the horns. The double axe is not a weapon. We know it was associated only with the goddesses. Plutarch states it's called labrys, which is linguistically similar to labyrinth. I can't help sharing some pictures of Knossos Labyrinth Temple. The Minoans had a myth of the Minotaur, a scare story to keep mainlanders from exploring, if not attacking, the island of Crete. The Greeks had a myth where they used a ball of string to not get lost in the labyrinth. They killed the Minotaur and made it back out alive. That's interesting from the standpoint of solving mathematical puzzles. That's kind of what you do when solving puzzles. You find a way to keep track of things, so that after you solve it, you can reproduce the solution. The Egyptians had a word for God as Neter. Likewise, they called goddesses Netert. Nater was a word they reserved for anything supernatural, which means it stood for anything they didn't know. The Egyptians' hieroglyphic symbol for Neter was a stone flint axe. Why? Because a stone axe was the first and primary thing they knew that could cut into nature or neter. Anything they thought was mysterious, they called a god. Since most of the universe was mysterious to them, God equals nature. Neter is linguistically analogous to nature. This mythology suggests, almost begs the Egyptians to sweep away the fear of God. This gospel of truth mathematics as the holistic viewpoint hammers away at all our assumptions and lays bare all the facts in a unified viewpoint. While some made this pseudo-mathematics about mazes, real mathematics did advance.